Well, good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN Sunday for Sunday, November 14th, 2021. We've got another great show this week, and members of the media, financial services, and academia are standing by to analyze all the news this week in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more. So sit back, relax, enjoy this episode of BRN Sunday. Let's kick things off with a look at what's happening on Capitol Hill, I should say. And joining me, they're known as the Legal Eagles, but they're also known as David Levine, Kevin Walsh. Both are principals with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, how are you this morning?
We are great, Jeff. It's good to be here. It sounds like someone's cooking breakfast even in the background.
It does. I'll take a waffle, and I'll also have some egg whites, whoever's doing that. All right. Let's talk about this proposal to reunite workers with retirement cash. Who wants to take that?
So, Jeff, it's always good being on the program. And on November 10th, the House Representatives Education Labor Committee, on a bipartisan basis, approved of a bill, the Retirement Improvement and Savings Act of 2021.
Hey, Kevin, what does bipartisan mean? I've lost the meaning of that word. Does that mean you and I agree on something?
Well, I mean, I think both sides at this point say bipartisan means that it picks up one vote from the other side.
That's true. That is so true.
So actually had broader support.
Wait, so this is a bipartisan Eagles podcast? That's awesome. Keep going.
It's bringing both sides of the Eagles together. So the RISE Act, it follows on Secure, which passed in 2019. And now this is really one of the first steps of passing legislation. You know, getting out of committee doesn't mean you've passed the House. It doesn't mean you've passed the Senate. It doesn't mean you've been signed by the president. So as just an FYI, we've got all three of those ahead. But it contains a number of notable provisions. The most significant, or the one that's getting the most attention, is a retirement savings lost and found provision. And David, do you want to highlight that, or do you want me to highlight that one?
Why don't you talk about that? I got another one in the hopper for me.
I thought that you were going to want to talk about that one because missing participants is always your big topic. This was not a way to try to throw it to you, only to eat more of your time. Have more me time this week.
You know, Kevin, just like the cybersecurity panel, where I happened to bring up missing participants just for you, I understand. Why don't you talk about missing participants?
So I think one of the things that it does is it raises the cash out limit from $5,000 to $7,000. And that makes it easier just to, reunite folks with their benefits earlier as opposed to waiting years later for them to become missing. And then the other big thing that it really does is it uses data to create an online registry for retirement accounts, and it would establish a lost and found at the U.S. Department of Labor. So it's a way that, it's no longer, it wouldn't just be the employer's job anymore. There'd actually be like a lost and found bin at the Labor Department that folks could go and, look in and see if their retirement benefits were among the other missing goods and services.
Hey, Kevin, I got to ask you a real question on that. How do we be sure that data is going to be kept secure?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I don't think we have time to talk about it this week. But if you did remember that executive order that came out reminding agencies, including the Labor Department, that there were critical weaknesses in their IT systems that they had 2 weeks to fix, and they had to develop a longer-term plan. So I do think it's a real concern as to, who's watching the watchers in the cybersecurity space. But David, that's not our topic this week.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up on a different topic. Another thing in here is a little bit more on multiple employer and plans and PEPs. Put simple English, this legislation.
David Levine, back to the acronyms. It's all acronyms all the time.
That's fine.
Well, you guys are honorary today. Go ahead.
Back to pooled employer plans. It would allow tax-deferred annuities described in Section 403B of the Internal Revenue Code to be multiple employer plans or pooled employer plans, just like their Section 401k cash or defer arrangements to be multiple employer plans. That's something that was a gap in the legislation passed at the end of 2019, and therefore it's a good expansion. Plus, for pooled employer plans, it would clear up an issue about who's responsible for making sure contributions are collected while Kevin drinks drinks his coffee. That's
or mixes his coffee,
would,
I think.
Exactly. And it would make it clear that it has to be someone other than the participating employer who has to collect these contributions. Now that I've avoided using any more acronyms, I thought I would hand it back to Kevin for his last round of popular items in the RISE Act.
So my last round of popular items, or I don't know if they're popular items, but things that are notable in the RISE Act. So to me, one that jumps out is that it's going to direct DOL to modify regulations for performance benchmarks for target date funds. And this is significant because it really, we've seen some speculation that target date funds may or may not be working the way they're supposed to work. In fact, last year or earlier this year, Senate Democrats asked the Congressional Research Service to review whether or not benchmark or target date funds were performing the way they were supposed to after the Pension Protection Act. And to me, asking the Labor Department to come up with new regulations around benchmarking the mix of asset classes in target date funds, it's something to watch just because when things are delegated to the agency, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how they're going to go or what those rules are going to be used for. So it could provide some clarity, but it could also provide some flexibility for the Labor Department to, either make it easier to incorporate new things or, ossify a certain type of asset mix as the go-to mix in light of the benchmarks they've provided. David, do you want to do your last round, and then we can fly away?
Sure. We can fly away. And to me, I think the last thing is recovery of overpayments. Something I think, Kevin, you and I talked about on our segment a while back. And I think this is something that's language that's gone through a lot of iterations. I know a colleague and one of our colleagues and I worked on an early version that tried to write this. It allows for some flexibility on overpayment correction, which goes beyond the IRS's relief in its correction guidance that they recently came out with in 2021. Very candidly, there's some bells and whistles to it, and there's some challenges. It's not as flexible as one might hope, but it's a good step forward. So on that note, I think we call it a day, and we should fly away or at least have our cup of coffee.
Well, gents, I want to thank you very much. And the RISE Act, I'm looking forward to the RISE Act actually rising this year. We'll see how it meanders its way through the Congress. Gents, thanks for joining us. Great segment, and we look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye, guys.
It's always good being on the show, and listeners, enjoy your weekend coffee.
See you again. Bye. Welcome back, and now we're going to talk technology, consumer products, you name it, we covered in this segment. Joining me now to discuss this, a lot more, Daniel Klein is lead advisor, executive producer for 7 Investing. Dan, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Good morning, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk streaming this morning. Really interesting. I saw Walt Disney Group, company, corporation, whatever they're called, released some numbers on Disney, overall numbers, and how the theme park did, and the, how things are post-COVID or theoretically post-COVID. One of the big pieces of news was that the number of streaming subscribers did not grow at the rate that was expected by analysts and Disney itself. And you're the person I wanted to get the rapid reaction from.
Yeah, this is a non-story. So a couple of things happened. First of all, you may have noticed, Jeff, that an awful lot of Americans signed up for Disney Plus in the first part of the pandemic. So basically, pandemic hits, we're all bored, we've all watched, Bridgerton, everything on Ozark, everything on Netflix. So we sign up for Disney Plus. And then in the past quarter, what exactly exciting new show have they put out? There's been a few minor things, but basically because of the pandemic, Disney had a slowdown in production. And while there's new seasons of The Mandalorian, there are unbelievable Marvel shows coming, a Hawkeye comes up next. But this quarter, there really wasn't that much. I actually went to Disney Plus looking to download some things for the plane. I was on a flight recently, and there was actually nothing new there. Now, admittedly, I tend to watch these shows, a new Mandalorian comes out, I'm watching it that Friday night or at least that Saturday night, certainly before the weekend is over. I'm not letting stuff pile up. But look, these are going to ebb and flow. If you're expecting to add 40 million subscribers in a year and you add 43 million in the first quarter, well, it's not that relevant what happens in the second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. So yeah, more growth is going to be global. And from an average revenue per user point of view, that's not as good because the numbers are lower, especially India. They make less money per person. But overall, Disney is forecasting 220 million subscribers by 2026. They're well on their way to getting there. They are well ahead of projections. And you mentioned theme park revenue. I could have told you that theme park revenue was light. But anecdotally, I will tell you it's picking up. I own a rental property. We went from no rentals in August, September, and October to being fully booked through March, except for a couple of dates that I'm using it. So the Disney 50th is going to be a giant driver. I'm not worried about this company, but I'm also not worried about the big streamers. So when you look at Disney, you can also rope in Netflix here. I think Amazon Prime is a different story because as much as I like some of the content on Amazon Prime, I'm watching Foundation right now, and it's shockingly good, a really hard book series, Isaac Asimov series to adapt. All of these are going to have these weird patterns where just like nobody signs up because so many people joined during the pandemic, and you're going to need drivers. And look, I'm more confident in Disney's drivers than Netflix's. They just released a giant budget movie with The Rock that's getting terrible, terrible reviews. And I'm not entirely sure Netflix has the ability to consistently make good content, but Disney clearly does. So there's just nothing to worry about here.
Dan, I want to let's change a little bit. Let's talk about consumption. Because streaming, as you said, Disney, Netflix, others during the pandemic, we're all working at home, hopefully, or dealing with our children, if you have them. So Netflix, these are places that consume content. And do you envision if we go back to the office, and it's going to be some return to the office that's not going to be the same. I mean, we're not going back working 5 days a week, most of us. Some, it'll be kind of this flexibility. But do you envision tastes, how people consume information, consume streaming, reverting back to the way it was? So now we're all going to go to the movie theater again. Now we're going to go back and, watch television, actual landline television.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. I think people predicting the death of traditional television have always been wrong. We're just changing how we buy it, and we're not going to like some of it because we're going to see some of our favorite niche channels not be available to us as we move to streaming live cable packages. Because those of us who like sports are likely going to have some form of streaming cable, if not actual cable. But these are going to be skinny bundles. They're going to be slimmed down. I don't think we're going back to the movies. I think, are there some consumption changes? Yeah. I sit on my couch most of the day, which I guess I did before the pandemic, but I wasn't as conscious of it. And I have ESPN in the background all morning because it's different than what I'm reading. And I'll watch the same show twice in a 4-hour period because I'm not paying that much attention. But my wife, who used to go to an office, who used to, get up at 6 a.m. with my son to get him off to school, and then she'd leave, 8 o'clock, whatever, go to the office. Well, she doesn't leave now, and she doesn't commute. So she goes in 1, maybe 2 days a week. So on those days, she actually has more time for television. My wife has more time to watch like shows that I don't watch with her. So I think she's burned through like half of Netflix and half of Hulu. And that's time that I actually think a lot of people have added to their schedule, like a little bit of additional downtime because they're not commuting. I think the bar might be higher. There's sort of two types of TV watching. There's me having ESPN or CNBC or whatever on in the background where I'm kind of vaguely paying attention. It's just sort of noise for my workday. It might be Cooking Channel or Simpsons episodes, whatever it is. And then there's shows you actually watch. Like you don't put The Mandalorian on in the background. You watch The Mandalorian. You might watch it twice. And I think that's, where we're not going to see changes. But good TV is always going to find a home. I think the movie business is really tricky. You're not going to see all that many, billion-dollar box office. And I think a lot of mid-range stuff is going to get cheaper and maybe more niche. You've seen it with the romantic comedies on Netflix move into a very Hallmark Channel world. So content's going to change a little bit, but honestly, not that much. And yeah, we'll watch more at home because you know what I have at home, Jeff? A 65-inch television. That's pretty good.
Yeah, well, it's almost as good as those big theater TVs. I was going to say projection screens. Dan, last question. Let's talk about consumer consumption. Phone, device, Roku, Fire TV. Um, how are people going to go back? I think there's this belief that we're going to go back to consuming the local news by sitting in front of the television. And I know you already answered part of this, but I just see consumer preferences. I think this has really expedited a lot of this and speeded it up so that people, they want what they want on demand on their device, and they if their spouse or partner has a different preference, so be it. They can watch it on their device, stream it to the television if they want. But how we consume and gather information, I think, is going to be through these little phones and tablets. We're not going back to, getting our news, for example. I even think, Dan, we're not going to get our news through Facebook and Twitter, for obvious reasons. I think we're going to be getting separate streams on our devices. But I'll give you the last word on this.
So I actually think it's going to be a mix. I mean, obviously my son is much more likely to watch things on his phone, but someday my son will live in a house with other people of his choosing instead of us. And in theory,
he wants to live with you, Dan. Come on.
Well, at some point I don't want him to, and I mean that in a positive way. Kids should grow up and eventually have their own lives. But look, it would be weird if my wife and I were both watching, I don't know, Law and Order or The Simpsons or whatever, watching the same episode, but on different devices while sitting on the couch. Like last night we watched This Weekend Saturday Night Live on Hulu, and we watched it on the TV. It doesn't make that much sense to watch it on a device. And there's always going to be some news that, or at least for now, that delivers on television. When there's a weather event here, you know what I have turned on all day? The local news. And I have a favorite weather guy, even though I watch very little local news otherwise. If you have kids in school, you're probably getting cancellations, either on your local news or on the radio. And I actually do get a lot of news through Facebook, but not through my Facebook feed, through Facebook News. And I've programmed Facebook News to give me New York Times and Wall Street Journal and credible sources, that I enjoy reading, and also lots of ridiculous, Star Wars news and other things that, maybe doesn't have to be as credible. And you can really actively program out, like, hey, I don't want this. And just because I clicked on this one article doesn't mean all of a sudden I want heavy metal news. I was just interested in, hey, there's an event coming to Miami. You can really create a really nice feed. And I think you see that on Flipboard. I think you see that to a point on Apple News, though I have not found Apple News as easy to program. So, yeah, how we consume is changing. But, Jeff, if you asked me 15 years ago, would I ever not get a Sunday paper? I would tell you, oh, my God, I love the Sunday paper. And, well, I don't get a Sunday paper. I'm not sure if there are Sunday papers the way I remember them. I'm sure the Boston Globe still puts out a wonderful Sunday paper chock full of sports and things I would like, but obviously I don't live in that area anymore. But things change, people change, and I consume news sort of all day long. And the idea of, like, my wife will turn on, like, the evening news with Lester Holt. There is nothing I want turned off faster than that. And once I get to the end of my day, I want The Simpsons on in the background. But obviously, you and I spend our days immersed in the news much more than the average person does.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think these tastes are here to stay. They're only going to evolve, and it's going to be based on our preferences. Dan Klein, always a pleasure chatting with you, my friend. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. We'll talk to you again very soon.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
Welcome back. Now we're going to close the show out with a little talk about travel. Joining us on the line, he is the intrepid travel, real estate, personal finance reporter for MarketWatch. I'm talking about Jacob Passy. Jacob, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So let's talk travel. I know that the CDC and the other governmental bodies, I think, are allowing people to come into the U.S. So we're actually going to get some tourists visiting the U.S., probably in your New York. But what do you have for us? What's top of mind when you think about travel?
Totally. So you're exactly right. International travel into the U.S. has resumed, this month so far. And, we saw some really, beautiful scenes in airports of families finally, reconnecting and seeing each other once again after almost 2 years apart or longer in some cases, obviously. because, if you had family abroad and stuff like that, it was really hard to visit them throughout COVID. So, and for them to visit you. So, really great scenes. And we really do see, that has led to a significant uptick in travel numbers. Over 2 million people passed through airports last Sunday. So not sure what's happening this Sunday, but it's interesting, when you start thinking about the, airports becoming more and more crowded and stuff like that, because the holidays are coming up and holiday travel is coming up. And, this is going to be an interesting travel season, this holiday season, because, travel experts I talked to for a story I did this week said that they're expecting it to be pretty much in line with pre-pandemic levels. I mean, lots of people are vaccinated. And, last year, obviously travel was still very, it picked up for the holidays, but it was still much lower compared to the normal. But I think, now that folks are vaccinated, the grandparents are vaccinated, kids are even getting vaccinated, I think a lot of families are going to be traveling once again to spend time together for the holidays. But that's going to, be kind of challenging because, this COVID era travel, it's still COVID era, even if you're vaccinated, is still much more challenging than it was before.
What do I need to know if I'm going to get on a plane? Let's start with planes because I think that's probably the most cumbersome. What do I need to know to get on a plane? Do you still wear a mask? Do I need to have a negative test? Do you have any of those details?
Yeah. So if you're traveling internationally, you'll have to, verify what the details are with whatever destination you're going to. Obviously, some people might use the holiday season as a time to travel internationally and then come back. You probably will come back to the States, I assume. So when you're coming back, even if you're an American citizen, even if you're vaccinated, you still got to get a COVID test when you're coming back. And it has to be negative. Obviously, if it's positive, you won't be allowed on the plane. You will have to show that at the airport. I this past summer traveled internationally, and sure enough, there was a long line at the airport where the desk agents, were checking everyone's tests for the flight to the U.S. So, you do have to have that in hand. Depending on where you're going to, you might need, proof of vaccination. Some countries require that, others don't. Domestically, it's still kind of normal. I mean, you kind of, my mother-in-law just visited me last week, and she traveled from Maine by flight, and, no one was checking anything because they're not required to. So, and that's something to keep in mind is if you're still especially cautious about COVID, worried about getting sick, if you're immunocompromised or visiting someone who is, you may want to think twice about traveling by plane. That being said, the airlines, argue that, planes are very safe, the air is filtered and all that. But you are spending time in an airport with a lot of people where that's not necessarily the case, and you might be seated next to someone and all, the whole 9 yards. So something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, though, aside from the safety aspect of things, is the airline industry has not quite gotten back up to speed in terms of its operations since the pandemic started. So as folks are probably aware, airlines during the pandemic were really hard hit. So they, in some cases laid off staff. They offered early retirement packages. They put workers on furlough. They grounded planes and were, operating with fewer fleets and all that. Slowly, they've been staffing back up. Slowly, they've been bringing planes back into service that were grounded for over the past year. But, as we've seen a number of times in recent months, there can be these massive waves of cancellations due to, a small disruption in one city. So a few airlines have had this happen. American Airlines, Southwest Airlines, Spirit Airlines, basically like bad weather in one part of the country caused a domino effect of cancellations across the rest of the country because all the airlines right now are operating with very little slack in their systems. And what that means is if one thing kind of goes wrong, it can very quickly set a course of events in place that cause cancellations or delays, in a more widespread manner because crews aren't where they need to be, the actual planes aren't where they need to be, and it can be a very challenging situation. So my story actually looked more at that. It looked more at the things that you can do to protect yourself from those sorts of disruptions.
Okay, well, you asked yourself the question, how do we protect ourselves so that we're not stranded in with grandma and grandpa? Which
Yeah,
by the way,
so
I loved my grandparents, and I would love to stay with. I wish they were still around so I could stay with them. But anyway, go ahead, Jacob. Sorry.
No. I feel the exact same way. So, first off, give yourself a buffer. A lot, especially like Thanksgiving, I feel like it's pretty common that people will travel just the day before. You don't get the whole week off or anything like that, as a national holiday. So you would have to take, vacation time and whatnot. But the less time you're giving yourself before the major holiday, the more likely it is that you'll miss the major holiday. If your flight is canceled and you were traveling on the Monday before Thanksgiving or the Monday before Christmas rather than, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving or the Friday before Christmas this year, Christmas Eve, you would, if you give yourself more time, there's more room for you to be rebooked. Because one of the issues with this is not only are they operating with very little slack, but they're not offering as many flights a day as they were pre-pandemic. And so there's less opportunities for you to get onto a new plane each day if your flight is canceled or seriously delayed. So that's the first tip. Second tip, kind of related to that, is avoid the peak times, because if you're traveling on the most busy days of the year, your flight is canceled, you can pretty much, you're pretty much guaranteeing that you won't get on another flight that day. So, again, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, those sorts of days, or the Friday after Thanksgiving or the weekend after, those peak times are going to be the when the airports are their busiest, and there's just not going to be available seats on other flights if your flight ends up getting canceled. So those, and if you have to, I understand some people do have to travel on those days. They can't get around it. So if you do have to travel those days, work your hardest to book your travel earlier in the day. Because if you have a morning flight, chances are, you'll have a better shot of getting rebooked later in the day. Whereas if you're getting obviously the last flight out that night, and it's canceled, you're out of luck. So, keep that in mind. And then in terms of looking at the airlines, do your research. Check how many times that airline flies between, your two destinations that day from your, original destination to where you're going. The more flights that airline offers each day, the more likely it is that you could be rebooked if your flight ends up getting canceled or delayed. Or you could see how many flights are offered a day for other airlines. And then do your research closer to the actual flight date so you can be prepared in advance. You can actually find out where your plane is coming from. So if you download the app for your airline, it will show you where the plane, what destination the plane is coming from that you are then going to be flying on. And why that's important to know is, for example, a few weeks ago with the massive waves of cancellations that happened with American Airlines, it was due to bad weather out of Dallas-Fort Worth, which is a hub for American. So if you are flying on a flight that just came out of one of that airline's hubs, and there's bad weather at that hub, then there's a good chance that your flight might be affected, even if there's not bad weather where you are. So, if you know that in advance, and usually this information is only available like the day of or the day before, if you know that information in advance and go to the airport, with that knowledge, you can kind of start researching, well, what other flight options do I have if this gets canceled? Can I get booked on this airline or this later flight of the day, things like that.
Yeah.
And that will prepare yourself with knowledge, because if the flight does end up getting canceled because of that, everyone's going to be rushing to the rebooking desk or hopping on the phone, and you want to be, prepared and ready to go so you can kind of get yourself to where you need to be. And then the last thing that I would add is, the value of trip insurance. And this is something I think you and I have talked about, Jeff, multiple times throughout the pandemic. But during COVID, trip insurance, I would argue, is more important than ever. But you have to be careful about the policies. Make sure that you're probably better off booking a cancellation for a broader policy that covers cancellations or delays for any reason, whether it's because sometimes they won't, sometimes trip insurance doesn't cover because of staffing shortages with the airline. They only cover weather, for certain policies, things like that. So you want to make sure that you get as comprehensive of a policy as possible, because there are so many different ways that a trip could get disrupted. Another thing to look out for, on the off chance you get sick at where you end up during your travels, you want to check that your coverage will include, if you need to book a hotel for a quarantine or something like that, because you can't fly if you're COVID positive. You want to be able to be covered by that with your travel insurance. Some booking websites, like Hopper is one. I've started to kind of integrate travel insurance type options into their booking, options. So with Hopper, they were telling me, you can add, for an additional fee, you can, add coverage that will rebook you if your flight is seriously delayed, or rebook you if your flight is canceled. And it's, I think, a bit more automated, so it's a little helpful in that way. So that's one thing you might want to consider. But yeah, travel insurance is very, very important, especially if you're spending a lot of money to fly the whole family out to visit grandma and grandpa.
Yeah, well, all good tips. I think also need to have the reset expectations that you probably will face delays. And if you have those types of expectations, it'll make your anxiety level come down, less fights, less arguments in the family, outside of the family. Jacob, we're going to have to leave it there. Always great chatting with you. I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we look forward to having you back again next week.
Talk soon.
Thanks, Jacob. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that wraps up this episode of BRN Sunday. Have a topic of interest, someone you think we should talk to, drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, check out today's edition of our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse. We're back again tomorrow, this time for BRN AM. We'll have a very special guest. Until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.